friction is a necessary evil. That means on one hand it is necessary, and on the other hand it is against us. I mean, it is not good for us. So we will look at both the advantages as well as disadvantages of friction. So first let us talk about why friction, why and how is friction necessary. It helps us to walk. Just imagine, had there been no friction at all, you are walking on a completely smooth surface. I mean, even if you spill a lot of oil on the floor and you feel that the surface is extremely slippery and you are not able to walk, but even that smooth surface is not perfectly smooth, because perfectly smooth surfaces do not exist. But on slippery surfaces itself, you are not able to walk. So how will you walk on a surface without any friction? So it helps us to walk. So when it helps us to walk, it definitely helps us to run and jog and do all kinds of movement. It helps us to hold things. We are able to hold objects because there is friction. There is some force which is preventing the object to move. Otherwise, if there is no friction, what will happen? Here in the picture you see that we are holding a carrot. So the carrot will not remain within our grip. So it will always continue to move. It will not feel like coming to rest ever. Stop a moving object. Had there been no friction, an object which is moving would have been moving forever. It would have never stopped. It helps us to start or stop a vehicle. So if you see the vehicles, like moving vehicles stop, or vehicles which are at rest, they start moving. That also happens because of friction. Because you see, initially when you apply a force to start, to make an object move which is at rest, so initially it doesn't move because the force of friction opposes its motion. But after some time, the force of friction doesn't increase any further, and then the object starts moving. So without friction, all these things will not happen. It helps in grinding. So you would have seen that for cooking various stuffs, you grind spices, often you grind vegetables and all. So all these are possible because you have a mixer grinder in your place. And that mixer grinder, if you see, that movement which happens inside the machine, that happens due to friction. Because if there is no friction, that movement will not happen. Helps in construction purposes. So when you talk about big constructions, so everything starts from small things. So you want to hammer a nail. So for that also you need friction, because if there is no friction, the nail will not get into the particular object where you want to hammer it. You will not be able to hammer it at all because everything will slip off. So you will not be able to do it. So there will be no construction. It helps us to write. We are able to hold the pen or pencil because of friction. And due to friction only we are able to write. Like if you take a paper which is completely oily, so do you think that you are able to write on it properly? You are not able to write on it because the friction is less in that case. Makes matchstick ignition. In this section, we are going to talk about increasing and reducing friction. So let us first focus on increasing friction. So what do you think? In which situation will we want to increase the friction? Where friction is desirable, of course. So friction can be increased deliberately in situations where it is necessary, wherever it is important, wherever it is good, wherever it is desirable, we will try to increase friction. Now, how can we increase friction? Friction is because of the nature of surface, right? By now we know the causes. So if the surfaces are pressed hard, friction will increase. If the surface is rough, friction will increase. So one very common way to increase friction is to make the surface rough. So if you have a smooth surface, you want to increase the friction, just make the surface rough by pouring something which is very rough in nature. For example, the treaded tires. So if you look at the structure of the tires very closely, you will actually see that the surface of the tires here. So the surface of the tires here have some designs or patterns like this, and they make the surface of the tire really uneven or rough. And this rough surface of the tire helps it to move well on the road, because when it moves on the road, since this is also rough, so the chances of slipping is less. Therefore, the vehicle can move in a better way with treaded tires. Not only tires, you can look at your shoe soles. It is not show, but your shoe soles. So just the bottom of your shoe. If you see, there are some patterns or designs made over it, and it is made in such a way that the surface is not smooth. So it is made rough so that it can have a better grip on the ground. So this is also another way of increasing friction. Spreading sand on slippery surface. Let us suppose if oil has been spilled over a surface in your house, what happens? You tend to slip over it. Why? Because the surface has become slippery. The friction has reduced. So now if you want to increase the friction, what do? First of all, you remove the oil. Just try it out. You just spread some sand over the surface. Now sand they are like particles, coarse particles. So when you spread sand over the surface, it makes the surface completely rough. That is why you would have observed that in the desert area, like if you go near a sea beach, so it is very difficult to walk on sand, because sand provides a lot of friction. The friction there is too high, which makes it even difficult to walk. So the friction also has to be in the appropriate amount. If there is no friction, we will not be able to walk. Even if there is too much of friction, that also makes us difficult to walk. In fact, when you look at the performances by the gymnastic people, so they would often need to hold objects and then hang over it, or hold somebody else's hands or legs. So they often they often apply some rough material on their hand, so that their friction on their hand increases, so that they get a better grip when they hold something, whether they hold a wire or a rope or somebody else's hands or legs. So they'll get a better grip. So these are some of the places where we see that we try to increase friction by making the surface rough. Now comes the turn for reducing friction. Those places where friction is undesirable, we do not want friction to be there, then in those places we try to reduce friction. So one such place would be obviously the machines, because as I told you that due to friction a lot of energy gets wasted in the form of heat in machines. So we will always like to reduce friction in machinery parts. And how do we do that? Let us have a look. Applying grease in machinery parts. So if you apply grease, the surfaces will turn to be smooth and therefore friction will reduce. That is one way. In fact, you would have seen this application. If you want, you can try it out at your home also. Sometimes the doors or the window panes, they start making a lot of noise. Why do you get that noise? Because of friction. Because when you close the door or when you open the door, they tend to make the noise because of friction, because the surfaces are moving over one another. Mostly these areas, because they are the joints. So if you apply grease
or oil, some oily substance to make the surface smooth in these areas, you will see that the sound disappears. That's because the noise doesn't come out anymore, because the friction has been reduced by the application of oil or grease. Applying powder on carom boards, I'm sure all of you would have played carom board sometime or the other. So when you apply powder on the carom board, what happens is the board becomes slippery. So it becomes easier to strike to strike various coins. So the movement is smoother and quicker on the board. Lubrication. What is lubrication? Now, applying oil or grease or any such oily material on a substance to make it slippery and smooth, this process is called lubrication.
Produce rolling friction. So it is the force of friction that acts between an object rolling over surface of another object. Now what do we mean by rolling over? We will take the same example of car. So you remember, as long as the car was at rest, but you are applying a force, but still the car is at rest. That means static friction is acting on the car. Now, as soon as the car starts moving, what's happening? Sliding friction was acting on the car. Now, how is sliding friction different from rolling friction? So let us have a close look. When we talk about sliding, we are just talking about one object sliding over another object. Let us suppose this wheel. If I say the wheel is sliding over the surface, that means the wheel is just moving like this. So it is just sliding on the surface. When I say that the wheel is rolling, that means the wheel is sliding, but at the same time it is rolling also. So it is rotating like this, as you can see here. So that is the difference between sliding and rolling. Now, how rolling friction helps? How rolling friction helps to reduce friction. Now, in this case, if you remember, I talked about static friction, sliding friction, and now I have introduced rolling friction. So I'll just compare the three. So in case of static friction, what happened? The object was at rest. Now when the object is at rest, the interlocking is maximum because the surface of the wheel and the surface of the floor which are in contact, they are like absolutely in touch with each other. So in this case, there is maximum interlocking. So the interlocking is max. Now since the interlocking is maximum, therefore friction is also maximum. Now what happens in case of sliding? Now when the object is sliding, in that case, now as the object is changing its position from one place to another, so this much is the surface of contact. So this is the area of contact. This much part of the wheel is in touch with the floor, but this surface is not remaining in touch for a longer period because it is changing its position from one place to another. So therefore in this case interlocking is less, therefore friction is also less. Now let us talk about rolling. What happens in rolling? In case of rolling, if you want, we will show it once again. So just observe what's happening here. Now here the wheel itself is moving like this. So that means at every instant of time, there is just one point on the wheel which is in touch with the ground. So at every instant, there is one different point which is in contact with the surface. So that means in this case at least this much portion was in touch with the surface, because it is moving, it is just sliding, it is not rolling. But when it is rolling, it is just one point, and that too one different point every time. So this one point which is in contact with the floor, that point is also changing. So just imagine, in this case there is no interlocking at all. So you can say that almost no interlocking takes place in this case, and therefore the friction offered during rolling is also negligible, because in this case only one point is in contact with the surface at a time. So one point in contact with surface at a particular time. So because of this, the interlocking is minimum, or you can say that almost zero. So interlocking is minimum, and therefore friction is also minimum. So rolling is another way of reducing friction, and that is why it is said that wheels were one of the best inventions to help the mankind, because when wheels were invented, after that there were many jobs which became very easy. So I will give you one example how rolling helps us to reduce friction and how that helps human beings. So we understood that rolling reduces friction. So as I said, let me now give a quick recap, and let me take an example to show you that how rolling can help in reducing friction and how that can help us, that is human beings. Now let us suppose you have a big box. Okay, so this box is right now at rest. Okay, in the next scenario you have the same big box, but now the box is sliding. So in this case, the box is sliding. And you have a third scenario where you have the same big box, but now you have wheels attached to the box. So in this case, the box is rolling. Now here, it is you who has to move this box. So in the first case, let us suppose this is you. So in the first case, you are applying force to the box, but the box is still not moving. So even though you are applying a force F, there is a frictional force which is static friction, due to which the box is not moving. Now, after some time, when capital F is greater than static friction, then the box starts moving. So in this case, what do? You apply a force from the side, and that's how the box is sliding here. But here comparatively the friction is lesser when compared to the first scenario. So this is first, this is second, and this is third. In the third case, what happens? Here also you are pushing the box. But since you have the wheels, you just need to apply very less force. So very less applied force in the third scenario. Here applied force is needed. And what about this? Here maximum applied force. So here you have to apply maximum force. Why? Because in this case you have maximum friction. In this case you have less friction. And in this case you have minimum friction. So since you have minimum friction, so you have to apply minimum force to make this object move. So that is why it has become very easy to transport objects from one place to another, because whatever heavy objects you have to transport, why do you want to apply more force, or why do you want to tire yourself to move it? You just put wheels on those objects and then you can reduce your effort. So that is how wheels turned out to be one of the best inventions which helped the mankind, because with the help of wheels only we were able to come up with so many different types of vehicles, so many different types of vehicles to carry the loads for transportation, and that's how made our work easier. So now that we discussed about rolling friction, I think it will be better to understand ball bearings. So let us see what are ball bearings. So these ball bearings are small steel balls which are placed between rotating parts of machines. Now, as I was telling you before also, that if you have parts inside your machine where one part is rotating over another, so the outer part which you see here is the fixed part, so this outer circle which you see is the fixed one, and the inside one is the rotating one. Now just imagine in case there were no balls, so in that case this rotating part will be rotating on the fixed part, so a lot of friction will be involved, so a lot of heat will get produced, so a lot of energy wastage will be involved. So that is why what is done is steel balls are being placed in between these two parts. So now what will happen, as one part moves, so let us suppose that this rotating part, the inside one, is moving. Now as this moves, these balls which are present here, these balls will start rolling. So as the inside part moves with respect to the outside part, the balls will start rolling on the two parts. Now when the balls are rolling, what is involved? Only rolling is. I spoke mostly about friction exerted by solids on solid objects. So friction associated with solid. What are fluids? Fluids are those anything that is capable of flowing. Anything that can flow is a fluid. So what are the fluids that we know? So when we say fluid, we talk about liquids which can flow like water, milk, oil, or we talk about gases like air, because that can also flow. So liquids and gases are collectively termed as fluids. Now the way friction can operate between a pair of solids, in a similar way they can operate between a pair of fluids or between a solid and a fluid. So force of friction exerted by fluids on objects moving through them is called fluid friction. Now many a times you will see that objects move through fluids. The best example would be the aeroplane. So aeroplane is flying through the sky, and what is sky made up of? It is made up of air. So aeroplane is actually moving through air. So aeroplane is a solid and it is moving through a fluid, that is air. Similarly, bird is flying in the sky. So it is also moving through fluid. The ship or a boat moving through water. So water is again a fluid, and the ship or boat is a solid which is moving through a fluid. So whenever an object is moving through a fluid, that fluid offers some resistance to its motion, and anything that opposes motion is friction. So that friction which is known as fluid friction. This fluid friction is also known as drag. This is just another term for fluid friction. So let us see what are the factors that affect fluid friction. So it is affected by the relative velocity between the object and the fluid, like with what speed the object is moving through the fluid, if the object is moving very fast or the object is moving very slow. So depending upon the speed of the object, the friction offered by the fluid will also change. Nature of the fluid. Now, when I say nature of the fluid, the nature could be what type of fluid is involved. For example, if it is a fluid like air, if it is a fluid like water, or if it is a fluid like honey. For example, if you compare water and honey, so what do you think? A boat will move easily through water, or it will move easily through honey? Of course, through water. That's because water is less viscous. So viscosity plays an important role. So it depends upon the resistance which is provided by that particular fluid. So viscosity of the fluid, density of the fluid, all these determine how much friction will be offered by that particular fluid, and that is why the fluid friction varies for different fluids. So it is easier to move an object through air than water. That is because of the lesser density and viscosity of air when compared to water. Shape of the object, and that is where streamlining comes into picture. Like if you see, there are certain organisms which exist naturally. We did not create them, and they are able to travel very comfortably through fluid. One such example is a bird. So look at the shape of a bird and try to compare it with the shape of an aeroplane. So they have little similarities, right? So the aeroplane has been constructed considering the shape of the bird, because the bird is able to fly comfortably through the fluid, that is air. So that means that particular shape of the bird is able to provide least, it is able to experience least fluid friction. So that is why the aeroplane was also considered in a similar way. And this process of designing an object in such a way so that it experiences least friction